So this is going to be a fun lecture. This is social cognition. This is one of my favorite topics, like I talked about in the last lecture. This is what I do, trying to figure out what's going on in the brain when we're trying to understand other people, when we're trying to put ourselves into their perspective and put ourselves in their shoes. Really, really interesting how our brain deals with this information and how it kind of sets information about others apart from information about the self. So we'll really get into kind of some of those differences. Social cognition, our ability to understand the minds of others. We are by far the most social species on the face of this planet. And our ability to be that social requires that our brain kind of makes these maps of what our social interactions should be like and allows us to really put ourselves in other people's shoes and to predict what they're going to do and how they're going to act. A lot of people think that we're using ourselves, the information that we have about ourselves, as kind of a template for understanding others. And we'll kind of get into stuff like that. So we're going to start with kind of describing what empathy is, our ability to kind of feel what other people feel, and look at some theories that have kind of arisen to try to explain how we achieve this and how we kind of make sense of other people's mindsets and mental states. We're going to explore theory of mind, which really is the idea of taking someone else's perspective. There's very specific brain regions that are involved with this type of thought process, this type of cognition. And then these last two bullet points here are getting into two of the main theories that have kind of arisen to explain this. One of them is simulation theory. So we're going to look at what's going on while we're simulating ideas and behaviors and things like that. And then we're also going to look at the mental state attribution theory, which really gets into how we form guesses and predictions about what people are doing, stereotypes and things like that, models that we use to try to understand other people's behaviors. That really gets into a lot of the theory of mind stuff. So let's go ahead and get started. Understanding the mental states of others. I kind of love this picture here. We've really started to find a lot of evidence that our brains are producing the same types of activity when we're thinking about the same types of things, when we're becoming empathetic, when we're trying to feel what someone else feels and things like that. Even though our brains are in two separate areas of space and it's different neurons and different wiring and whatever, somehow we see similar patterns in two people's brains. And that fascinates me, that it just shows that there's something kind of shared between us and something that kind of underlies the way that our brains activate. So we'll get into that and we'll kind of look at how that is being explained by modern cognitive neuroscience theories. So we'll start with empathy, empathetic accuracy, right? So empathy is this idea that the perceiver, so me, being able to correctly infer the target, someone else's, thoughts and feelings. How well can we guess what they're feeling and what they're thinking? And you see some idea here. So we can do this. We're not perfect at it, right? So strangers usually have a score of about 20% when they're looking at what someone they've never met is feeling or thinking. When we change that instead to a close friend instead of a stranger, you get a little bit of boost in accuracy. They're about right about a third of the time, but it's not perfect. So even though we've developed these really good strategies of trying to predict how other people feel, we're not just 100% most of the time. And I think that there's a lot of individual difference here. So some people really wear their heart on their sleeves. They have personality traits that are very visible. And with those kind of people, this number may rise. We may be a lot more accurate. You may have a friend that it's really easy to tell what they're thinking or what they're feeling. So these numbers that we're looking at here are more averages across all the different types of people. And so this includes people that are very reserved and kind of hold their feelings to themselves. And this is what it kind of averages out to. So even spouses are only right about a third of the time. And this kind of talks a lot too to our ability as humans to really hide our intentions and to hide our feelings. And we'll kind of get into what's going on in the brain when we're trying to work out that mismatch between outward behavior and inward intention. And this is very much in contrast to the way that information is processed about the self, right? With the self, we have these really rich autobiographical memories, and we know what's creating our mental states, why we're feeling the way that we're feeling. And we don't have this really rich set of information when we're thinking about others. We have to rely on these kind of external clues, body language and actions, the way that their eyes look. We pay a lot of attention to someone's eyes. So very, very different kind of thought process going on, different types of information that are going into these different calculations between how I feel and how someone else feels. There've been kind of two theories that have kind of arisen to try to explain how we're doing this, how we're kind of understanding other people's position. So one of them is the mental state attribution theory. This is kind of the new name for it. It used to be called theory. Really glad they came up with a new name for it because that's just ridiculous. It was all about making theories about other people, so I thought that would be a good name. This is kind of, I think, a little bit more applicable, trying to attribute some type of mental state to another person. And so what they argue is that we've kind of created this, what they call a common sense folk psychology. This is really, we've developed stereotypes. We've developed kind of models of the way that the people around us are supposed to act based on contextual clues, based on their personality traits and things like that. With a certain type of person, they should act a certain type of way. We're kind of building a model to infer the thoughts of other people. And from that, so this kind of gets into that information I was just talking about. So we take information about their past, information about what's going on contextually right now, how their family is made up of, like what the culture is like, all different kinds of things that we use, and we kind of build up this model. And we use that model to kind of infer whatever it is they're thinking. This is something that is put kind of in contrast to this other theory called simulation theory. It's also been called experience sharing theory. I see simulation theory a lot more often in the literature. And it really kind of came about because they started to think about this idea of mental state attribution, of like these cognitive processes that go into putting all of these different pieces together, the past and their actions and their family and all of these things. And they argue that we may be doing that in certain situations, but most of the time in social situations, our understanding of others is really fast. It's really immediate. We're not actively contemplating those different factors. That stuff is just kind of already in place. And so what they think is actually happening is that instead of using this kind of elaborate theory that we've generated about how these people think, what we're doing really is just kind of simulating what it is that they're thinking. And our brain is really, really good at simulation. We can simulate what the future is going to be like. We can kind of put ourselves back in the past and simulate what the past was like. And they think that this is kind of the same thing, that we can simulate another person's perspective. We can kind of put ourselves into their shoes. And a lot of it, as we'll kind of get into, they think that we're kind of using the knowledge that we have about ourselves as kind of a reference point to simulate others. So if others are like us, then we're a lot better at simulating them. But if they're not like us, then it's really hard for us to kind of put ourselves in their shoes and to figure out why they're doing what it is they're doing. So we'll get into some evidence that kind of gets at this, and some of it's kind of still up for debate these days, but we'll kind of get into the differences between the two. So before we get into that, we'll talk a little bit about theory of mind. It's also been termed mentalizing. You'll see mentalizing on some of the slides that we go through. But the idea of theory of mind is that it's this ability to recognize that someone else has their own unique perspective, that they have a mental state just like we have a mental state. And there's some interesting ways that they test whether or not someone has good theory of mind that we'll kind of get into. And so what we usually do, kind of our first step with theory of mind, is that we kind of attribute these intentions to others. We try to understand why it is they're doing what they're doing using the contextual clues and everything that we have. And kind of after that, what follows that is that sometimes we also kind of look at beliefs and desires. I think that the intention part is a lot more immediate and kind of automatic, and that the beliefs and desires kind of come from trying to extrapolate off of that, try to really understand who that person is, rather than just why they're doing what they're doing. So this was just kind of an example from the book. So when you're seeing a woman rummage through her purse, you're kind of inferring that if she's looking through her purse, she's maybe walking towards her car, she's probably trying to find her keys. You're not necessarily thinking about what she's thinking. You're just kind of inferring what it is she's probably about to do. You wouldn't kind of take the next step of like saying that she's a neurotic person because she's looking for her keys. That would kind of be this next step of like belief and desire and things like that. So that's something that kind of comes after you've kind of contemplated it a little bit more. But this intention part seems to happen kind of very quick and automatic. And we'll get into kind of near the end of the lecture some brain regions that have been linked to our ability to recognize these different mental states in others. I love this picture. I can't wait to do this with my kid because this was a really cool bit of information that I learned just recently, honestly. So when babies come out, they're completely helpless, right? They can't do anything on their own at all. And they have this need to connect to their caregivers, to connect to someone that's going to provide them that help. And what they think is kind of really important in those respects is this idea that they can mimic others. So an infant prefers to look at the face. This is what they're kind of drawn to. It seems like they have a lot of these cognitive abilities already to recognize faces and to recognize emotion on faces. But they have this really cool ability to imitate whatever the other face is doing. And we think that this imitative behavior is a way to try to connect, a way to try to say, I'm like you, take care of me. And this happens at 42 minutes to 72 hours after a baby's born. They'll start mimicking. I can't wait to do this with my kid. It's going to be so cool. But they imitate these facial expressions. You open your mouth, they open their mouth. They're trying to copy you. They're trying to be like you, right? And to take those cues to try to get this type of social connection, take care of me, be with me. And a lot of researchers believe that this imitative behavior is kind of the first step to developing theory of mind. This understanding that someone else is doing something, they must be different than I am, and I can in some way try to mimic or understand that by doing it as well. And we'll kind of get into like mirror neurons and how that might be kind of playing into this. But really, really interesting that this happens at such an early age. So the idea that I kind of want you to take away from this slide is that from really, really young, we're already primed to kind of be social and to reach out and to kind of imitate and mimic. And we really think that imitation is what's kind of building up the brain's ability to understand the perspectives of others. And so some researchers, when they were studying this idea of perspective taking, of understanding that someone else has a different perspective, has a different mental state than you, they came up with this thing called the false belief task. And it's commonly used with Sally and Anne, or the two characters within this story. And so you have a kid or a person, whoever, that kind of watches this story unfold, and they're asked a question at the end. And so we'll kind of work through this one step at a time. So you have Sally up here, walks in, and she drops a marble into this bucket. And then Sally walks away. So she's gone, she leaves the room, and Anne is the one that's left. Well, Anne walks up, and she grabs the marble out of the bucket, and she drops it in the drawer. And so Sally is gone this whole time. She's not witnessing this at all. She doesn't see that Anne has taken the marble out and put it in the drawer. And then Sally returns, and she wants to find her marble that she left. And so the question that you pose to these children, or whoever is doing this task, is, where is Sally going to look for the marble? So in order to do this task correctly, you need to be able to understand that Sally and Anne have different and unique perspectives on the world. Because if you don't believe that they have different perspectives on the world, then you're going to make kind of the wrong decision about where Sally is going to look for the marble. And so in that example we just went through, people that are unable to recognize these two characters have unique perspectives, that they've seen the world in a different way, will predict that Sally's going to look in the drawer. So I'm going to go back a slide real quick. So Sally doesn't know that the marble has been moved, but someone that doesn't have theory of mind, someone that isn't able to kind of put themselves into someone else's shoes and understand that other people have a different perspective than they do, they're going to say, well, it was put in the drawer. Like Sally should know that it was put in the drawer because I saw Anne put it in the drawer, so she's got to know too. It's kind of assuming that other people know what you know. So you really have to understand that they have these different perspectives to be able to guess that Sally is going to look in the bucket. She's not going to look in the drawer. She's going to look where she put it because that's the only knowledge that she has. She doesn't share the knowledge that we have. And so there was this finding from here that showed that children don't really reliably pass this test until they're about 4 years old. And so for a long time in the literature, there was this idea that like children didn't have theory of mind until they were a bit older, until they really started to develop a lot of these different brain regions. And we kind of talked in that last slide about how they have this imitative behavior really early on, and it kind of started this debate. And a lot of researchers believe that it wasn't that these children didn't have theory of mind, that they didn't understand that other people had different perspectives than them. They just thought that this task was too hard, that it was too logical for young children to really understand. And so they tried to start kind of testing this idea in a different way. And they started to look a lot at what's been called joint attention, the fact that two individuals kind of track each other's attention and kind of share their focus on the same object. And what they found is that young children, infants, about 12 years old, if they know that an adult doesn't know where an object is, they will point to it, right? And this kind of demonstrates that the child, this 12-month-old child, knows that the adult has a different perspective as them, because if the adult does know where the object is, they don't point. And so there's something, they know that they have different knowledge about what's going on in the room than that adult does. And this kind of gets at this idea that maybe it is a lot earlier than 4 years old. They've really developed this idea that we're different people and we have different perspectives, because there's this really nice kind of behavior that demonstrates that. And then by the time they're about 15 months, so not even a year and a half yet, they show surprise when this adult or whoever comes into the room and searches in some kind of box or container for a toy that was put there when they weren't there. They're like, whoa, how did you know that was there? And so it shows that they knew that adult had different knowledge than they did, or else they wouldn't have been surprised, right? It knew that they should have had a false belief, and were really surprised when they didn't. Right? So kind of what this slide is getting at is this idea that joint attention, this idea that we've seen that infants can kind of track our attention and track what we're looking at and what we're doing, and know that we have different knowledge than they do, is kind of this evidence that this theory of mind, this perspective taking thing, is kind of an innate cognitive ability that really develops really early on and allows us to be as social as we are. And so they've kind of looked at these developmental stages of understanding others' intentions and beliefs. And so this kind of comes from that earlier work. It's pretty robust. So we have this evidence of like the joint attention and things like that, but really putting yourself in someone else's perspective kind of happens when children are 3 or 4, of really being able to describe something from someone else's perspective. And the researchers that are involved, so like Jamil Zaki is one of them, that are really involved in kind of mental state attribution theory. I really think this is when we start to really build models of other people's behaviors. We start to really kind of stereotype and create these prototypes of what people should do based on our memory of them. And a lot of it's tied into a lot of these memory processes and things are really starting to kind of kick into high gear around this age too. So we have a lot more knowledge and information to draw on at this point. By about 5 and 6, we start to get to, instead of just kind of understanding intention, predicting what someone's going to do, this is when we start to kind of understand that people have different beliefs, that they think about the world in a different way. By about 6 or 7, we kind of look at how literal meanings of words can only express kind of part of a person's intention. So this is where they start to really understand sarcasm, and they can start to tell jokes and things like that, where they kind of twist words. Before 6 and 7, these kids will kind of believe everything you say as a caregiver or as someone that they trust. They don't really question that there are like non-literal meanings to the things that you're going through. And then by about 9 or 11 is when, by 9 to 11 is when we really start to see that we can understand kind of more empathetic type things, that the people's feelings have been hurt, that we're able to kind of feel what they feel. We've really built up models, and we've experienced so much of those emotions at this point that we can really start to simulate them and understand them. And so this just shows that there's kind of this developmental trajectory that even though as a child we kind of have this ability to understand that we're in a different perspective, that perspective taking kind of evolves and gets more complex and gets better. And we start to become better at predicting other people's behaviors and other people's beliefs and things like that. And so we'll get into now some more of kind of the brain stuff. So we'll get into the 2 different theories. So we're going to start with simulation theory. This one's a bit longer. There's a lot of data on simulation theory. And I think that simulation theory and mental state attribution theory, they both kind of have their place. I don't think that one kind of disproves the other. I think there's just been a lot more work because of some early findings on the simulation side. So we'll start with the MPFC, right? So it's the medial prefrontal cortex, kind of my favorite brain region. Right on the midline here of the prefrontal cortex, really, really heavily involved in social stuff. So we kind of went over this point of mimicking people, and it kind of leading to our ability to simulate other experiences and other people. And what they've found is that there's this activity in this medial prefrontal cortex that lights up when we're thinking about ourselves, but also lights up when we're thinking about other people. And it's kind of suggested, and we'll look at some data that kind of gets into this, that the reason there might be this overlap, the reason that we might see self stuff in the same region as other stuff, is that we're really using a lot of the information that we have about ourselves to really try to simulate what other people would be doing. Because all we really have to draw on is what we've experienced. And so if they're doing something similar to what we've experienced, we can kind of draw on those past memories and things like that to really try to bring that up and to try to simulate it, to give us a better perspective of what they might be going through. And when you really look at, so this was from a meta-analysis over here on the left, that looked at just kind of self-other activations across tons and tons of different studies. And you notice that there's some very similar regions. You notice that kind of this one is a little bit more ventral as far as self stuff goes. So that would be kind of this area right here. And then other stuff kind of tends to drift a little bit more dorsal. But there's a lot of areas here that are activated for both. And we'll see some evidence on this next slide of what might be going on there. This stuff back here, this is the PCC. It's the posterior cingulate cortex. It's part of the default mode network that we talked about last week. This has some heavy ties to the medial temporal lobe. So a lot of people think that this is what's kind of bringing up memories and instances and things like that, really setting the scene. Another region that's not shown here because it's lateral, and this is showing us kind of a medial perspective of the brain, is the TPJ, the temporal parietal junction, which we'll kind of talk about when we get into theory of mind and what brain regions are involved there. But we'll start at kind of looking at medial prefrontal cortex, very heavy social area, really heavily implicated in both self versus other. And so you kind of see these different types of information about others that have been used to study this. This versus here means that this is where self is greater than some semantic knowledge about something. This is where self is greater than other. This is where self is greater than an intimate other. And then this is just kind of self-relevance. So if something describes you, the reason there's no verses is because this is saying that this is above baseline. Instead of above some specific other condition, it's saying, show me where activity is greater than baseline. And then that would be the same for all of these. So show me where mentalizing or theory of mind is greater than baseline, and all of these other ones. So just kind of interesting thing to take away here is that there's really heavy involvement of this medial portion of the frontal cortex, and that there's a lot of overlap between self and other. And so there was a study done by Mitchell's team at Harvard, Jason Mitchell. And the conditions of the study is that they had all of the subjects, they came in and they read these descriptions of two people. So it was this whole kind of synopsis about who this person is and what their beliefs are and all that kind of stuff. One of the people that they read about shared political views with the actual subject. So if the subject had indicated that they were Democratic or that they leaned more liberal, then this one would be liberal as well and would have kind of similar views. And they kind of tailored these paragraphs to really kind of match up with who that subject was. They wanted to make this person very similar to who the subject was. And then they created another subject that was kind of the opposite, that really was as dissimilar as they could make it to the subject. And then they put them in the scanner and they had them answer questions about their preferences and had them answer those same questions about others. And so they had information about what was going on in this subject's brain when they were thinking about themselves, when they were kind of making these judgments about who they were. But they also had information about what was going on in this person's brain when they were thinking about who these kind of fictional people were, one of them being really similar to them and one of them being not similar at all to them. And what they found was that this ventral portion of the prefrontal cortex, which is right in here, was really heavily active for self, but it was also active for similar others. So if someone was similar to me, it was activating the same regions as the self type judgments were activating. But if the person wasn't similar to me, if they weren't like me at all, that activity drifted north. It drifted dorsal. And so you have this dorsal portion of the prefrontal cortex up here that was representing not similar people. And so this led these researchers, and this really kind of started this whole movement of self-other kind of ideas of how this gradient kind of came about. It really tied into this simulation idea that maybe it's these people that are similar to us. The reason the activity is in the same spot as the self activity is because I can use myself as a template to understand someone that's like me. They have the same beliefs. They have probably similar experiences to me. They come from a similar culture. And so I can use my experience. I can use who I am and predict what I would do to try to understand what that person would do. But if that person's not like me, there's no overlap with the self regions. We're kind of using this kind of general knowledge, researchers believe, is kind of what may be going on in this kind of dorsal region. And this is really, really interesting because it really ties into acceptance in general, right? Accepting other people, really bringing other people in. If we really feel like they're like us, and this was from these first studies. It really looked like it was similarity that was kind of driving this whole thing. But researchers have kind of started to dig into this effect a little bit more. And found that it may not be similarity per se, that it could, what a lot of researchers are kind of leaning towards is that it may be more about relatedness than necessarily similarity. And so relatedness gets more into ideas of familiarity, how close you are to these people, how important you are emotionally to that person, how warm you are to that person, different types of competence and knowledge that you have about that person. And some of the studies that have shown this, so there was a study from Oshner and Beer that found that there was similar activity for self and romantic partner, even though when they filled out these personality ratings and things like that, the romantic partner was actually very dissimilar to the self in terms of what they like and what they were into and all of these kind of things. But they still had this kind of self-other overlap in that ventral portion of the medial prefrontal cortex. Showing that it maybe wasn't that like it was because they were similar to me that I was kind of using myself as a template, but really it was more that like I understand them because I'm close to them. There was this other Randy Buckner study all about clan mentality that it really drove this idea that they think that rather than similarity, it really is driven much more by closeness. This is something I kind of ascribe a little bit more to. It gets into this kind of tribal effect that you really kind of understand the people that are closest to you. We don't really know what these regions of the brain are actually calculating. We don't know what kind of information is being represented there. We think that that ventral region is the self region, quote unquote. But it could just be that that's the region that we use to really understand and try to predict what people are thinking that we know really well, that we have a lot of information about. The self is one of those people. We have a lot of information about the self, but we also have a lot of information about the people that are closest to us. So that could be something that's kind of driving that. So something to kind of take away here. So Mitchell on the last slide found that that similarity was kind of driving this difference in brain activity. And as people kind of picked into that, they found that it wasn't just similarity. So similarity was one of the factors that could have been driving this, but it really seems to be more about kind of how close you are, whether or not that person is part of your tribe, part of your clan, right? Part of your friend group or your family. And as these kind of self-other studies started to roll out, there have been some kind of issues with the statistics involved. So most of these original studies, like the one that we saw with Mitchell that we just talked about, it was self versus some other person. So this was another study that we talked about in the last lecture. So it was self versus George W. Bush. In this case, we're comparing self to some other that we don't know or some kind of fictional other, like we just saw in that Mitchell study. It was just some person that had been kind of made up that was similar to us or not similar to us. It wasn't a real person. And the brain activity that we're interested in is what's going on in people's brains when they're actually interacting with real people that they know, people in their social network, strangers, things like that. This doesn't really get at that. This kind of gets at the idea of it. But if we're comparing ourselves to someone we don't know, just someone that kind of has broad knownness, I guess, or ourselves to some fictional character, it's not really getting at what we want to get at as social neuroscientists. And so some studies tried to kind of fix this. And instead of using some just like fictional character or some famous person, instead they had the subjects name a friend. And so it was like, okay, we're going to have each subject think about themselves in relation to like a best friend or a family member, right? That's what we're seeing here. But here we have some different kind of problems that arise because we're starting to get at brain activity that's associated with a specific person, right? So this is someone that person actually knows, but the friend is going to be different for every subject. This friend is going to have different traits. They might be a completely different personality than a friend that someone else picks in the study. There's going to be different levels of closeness or familiarity with the subject. And this really kind of creates some issues statistically, because if you're trying to compare the brain activity in all of your different subjects, and each subject has a different target that has all kinds of different things, it's really hard to control a lot of that stuff. And so there's a really cool new paradigm that was actually my advisor created that gets around these issues. It's called the round robin design. And this was a big study that our lab just finished. We brought in tons of groups, small social networks. And what you do in these types of situations, instead of just having someone pick a friend, you bring in a whole group of people. And every single person goes through the study. And so that means that every single person is a perceiver and a target. So that means when this person comes in, she's going to be scanned while she thinks about herself. And she's also going to be scanned while she's thinking about who this person is. She's going to be thinking about who this person is and who this person is. And so we have data on what's going on in her brain while she's thinking about herself and while she's thinking about all these people in her social network. These could be coworkers, these could be fraternity brothers, they could just be friends, they could be people that live together, a family, whatever. So this really allows us to really kind of dive into that actual activity, and it controls a lot of those problems that we were talking about. All of the targets are real people, they're not fictional. They can kind of vary on levels of similarity, levels of familiarity, and all that kind of stuff, because they're the same for each person. These targets are the same in the group, right? Each person has the same target. So this person is going to think about all of these people. This person is going to think about all of these people. The only thing that changes is who the self is in any given circumstance. And then it allows the statistical analyses to be kind of maintained within each group. All right. So the problem with the second set that I was talking about earlier was that if each of these people had just picked a random friend, like this person was thinking about this person was thinking about this person, whatever, it makes the statistics really hard. But if you have everything kind of maintained within this group and all of the targets are kind of maintained within this group, it really kind of makes everything a lot smoother. And so what arose from this? So we have a huge data set. There's a lot of different angles that we're looking at this from, seeing whether or not these two people have a similar representation of this person based on how good of friends they are, seeing whether or not there's like positivity driving this or negativity driving this. A lot of different things that we're looking at. But this was a big finding from my advisor's first study that he did. So he brought people in, he brought this big group of people in, round robin style, and had them either thinking about themselves or thinking about one of those other people in the group, doing what's called a trait adjective task. So they were shown the word self and a word like lazy, and they were saying, say yes or no if that word describes you. So are you lazy? Yes or no. And then on other trials, they would see the names of their friends. So is Bob lazy? Is Sally lazy? And there was a bunch of different trait words, so ambitious and empathetic and all of these different things. And so after a ton of trials, we have brain data on what's going on in that person's brain when they're thinking about who they are and what's going on in their brain when they're thinking about who all those other people in their group are. And what we can kind of do with this is we have this region of the prefrontal cortex right here. This is the MPFC. And we can pull out all of the activity values. And so each of these is an individual voxel that came out of that area. And each of these is just a number. It's a voxel value. And so we can say, okay, this is the brain activity. This is the pattern of activity that's going on in this person's brain when they're thinking about themselves, right? Now, this is everybody else in the group thinking about them. So this first one is one person thinking about who this person was. This other one is another person thinking about who this person was. And what we can do is we can say, okay, we have this person thinking about themselves and we have the whole group thinking about them. We can compare those two patterns of activity. And what he found was that the activity that's going on in your brain when you're thinking about who you are matches the activity in others people's brains when they're thinking about who you are. Somehow this idea of who I am, the activity that represents who I am, is sort of recapitulated in the brains of other people. And so somehow we're kind of sharing these representations, or we're building the same types of representations. So it's a really, really interesting finding. And it's really hard to say what was driving this. I just replicated this finding. So we just hit the first time that he did this, he did it with one big group of 11 people. We just did this with 20 groups of 5 or 6 people, 114 people total. And we found this exact same thing, that somehow the activity that represents who I am matches the activity in someone else's brain when they're thinking about who I am. Really, really interesting effect that we have no idea how it's coming about or anything like that, but really exciting to write up. If you guys are interested in this was kind of a really quick walkthrough. This is kind of a complicated study. In the folder that has all of the recordings for all of the lectures, there's something called Round Robin, and it's an hour-long presentation that I did on this whole study that really dives into what we did and what we found. Really, really cool study. So if you guys are interested, kind of dig into that. This one, I added this slide yesterday, so this is not in your version of the slides, but this was a really, really cool, groundbreaking study that came out of Carolyn Parkinson's lab. So she collected data from the entire business school at UCLA. Basically, she had a list of everybody's name that was in the business school, and each person then went through and indicated whether they were friends with anybody on the list. And from that, she was able to build an entire social network. So she knew exactly who was friends with who. She knew whether or not you were kind of 2 steps away from somebody. So let's say that I was friends with Bob and Bob was friends with Sally. That means that I'm 2 people, I'm a distance of 2 from Sally. I'm not friends with Sally, but I'm friends with someone who is. Now, if Sally is then friends with someone else, I'm 3 steps away from that someone else because I'm friends with somebody who's friends with somebody who's friends with somebody. It's kind of how these social networks work. And it's important to know that because it's going to tie into kind of what the findings were. So she ended up taking a sample out of the business school. So she didn't scan the whole business school. That would have been really expensive and crazy. But she took a sample from the business school. So she had the whole network from the business school, and then she took a small group of people from it, and she put them in the scanner and had them watch video clips of different media type things, like comedy clips, drama clips, romance, whatever. She had a full spectrum of all these different genres because she wanted to kind of sample all of the different ways that we kind of view the world and view entertainment in general. And what she found was really, really interesting. The degree to which the patterns of activity in the brain, so that's what this is kind of getting at over here. So something that's red means that that region of the brain was very similar in 2 people. And the degree to which they were similar predicted how far they were in the social network. So if their brains represented these media clips in a similar way, so that meant the activity was tracking the same way. The same types of brain regions were coming on for different things, for comedy or for drama or whatever. If they represented it the same way, it was more likely that they were friends, that they were a distance of 1. And as the kind of activity became more dissimilar, it indicated that they were farther away in the social network. It was this really, really interesting thing. So that somehow, like, if we're really good friends with somebody, we kind of represent the world in the same way. We have the same activity in our brain. And as we become kind of farther away from people, kind of in friend space, that brain activity becomes a lot different. But it really kind of begs this question of, did we become friends because we see the world the same way, or do we see the world the same way because we're friends? It's kind of this chicken or the egg type thing that we haven't been able to work out yet, but really, really cool finding. I've found some similar stuff in the round robin study that we've been doing, showing that people that are friends have more similar brain activity than people that aren't. I can't explain why that is, but I'm sure that the future is going to bring some really cool stuff on that front. So a lot of people think that this is kind of being driven by the mirror neuron network, that we're using these mirror neurons to kind of replicate and mimic what other people are doing to try to kind of put ourselves in their perspectives. And this could be what they're thinking is kind of the mechanism that we use to empathize, to really create the same types of physiological feelings in our body that other people are feeling in theirs, to be able to really simulate what they're going through. And you really want to kind of differentiate empathy and sympathy, especially if you're going to go into like the clinical side of things. So empathy is really trying to put yourself in their shoes, kind of come down into the hole with them, try to feel what they're feeling, try to feel sad when they're feeling sad. Whereas sympathy is just recognizing that they're sad. Like, oh, you're sad. I'm sorry. That must be really bad. It's, I think, a lot more powerful as a clinician to exhibit empathy than it is to exhibit sympathy. If you can really get into the same shoes as your client and really kind of get down onto that same level and really try to feel what it is they're feeling, I think you can give a lot better care than just recognizing, oh, that must be bad. I'm really sorry. That's more of the sympathy route. There are certain professions, though, where you don't want to feel what they're feeling that we'll kind of get into as well. But this kind of ties into the same stuff we were just talking about. So this is the perception action model of empathy, kind of builds off of what we just really described. And so it's this idea that we are able to create the same affective state in ourselves as what we're seeing in someone else. So activated in the observer, in us, we're able to trigger the same somatic and physiological responses in ourselves that someone else is feeling. So we can experience what someone else is experiencing, basically. And a lot of people are proposing, like we just talked about on that last slide, that these mirror neuron networks are really giving us the ability to do that. That the same types of neurons that are active when we're feeling sad can be activated when we see someone that's sad. And it can really get a lot of those processes flowing, those physiological processes that we talked about in the emotion lectures. And this is referred to as embodied simulation, really feeling what other people feel. But researchers have argued that in order for this to be true, we have to be able to present some evidence that the mirror neuron system is connected to these emotional coordination systems, to the physiological mechanisms themselves. And so that's what we'll kind of get into in this next slide. So there's been a lot of evidence from primate research where they're actually able to kind of get into the brain and really dig into what's connected to what a lot easier than they can do in humans. And they've found that these mirror neuron networks are really heavily tied to the insular cortex. And the insula is something that really is kind of the interface between the cortex and the limbic system. And if you remember, the limbic system is the system that's really heavily involved in emotional processing and really getting those physiological processes started. And so this is kind of that connection, they think, between the mirror neurons that are kind of distributed throughout the cortex and how they're kind of interacting and allowing us to create those physiological experiences. So disgust is an emotion that the researchers have used a lot to try to kind of piece this out in humans, because it's an emotion that's really easily triggered in humans. We can get people to feel it really easily. And we can also see what's going on in the brain when they're witnessing it on someone else. And so what they've found is that the brain activity that's present when we're feeling disgust kind of matches up when we're recognizing it on someone else. And we see this insular activity when we're feeling disgust, and this insular activity when we're also seeing someone else display disgust. And what you can see here is that the activity kind of tracks with how much disgust that person is actually showing. And so as the emotion becomes more intense in someone else, the activity becomes more intense. And we show that these same regions are also active when someone gets a whiff of a bad odor. So when we've actually got them to really feel this feeling of disgust. So this is really good link in humans. It's not as clear cut as what we see in primates, because we're really able to dig in a lot more with the primates. But this is a really nice, clear example that the same regions are activating in emotional terms and actually getting these physiological things started that are happening when we're actually seeing it on someone else. So it could really be tying into this mirror neuron idea. And they've also seen this with pain. This was actually one of the papers that a lot of people picked for their term paper. And it was the study that showed that the insula and the anterior cingulate cortex were active while experiencing pain, but were also active when we were seeing someone else that we knew, kind of witnessing them get pain, get shocked. ACC, I have that highlighted here because ACC has been kind of heavily implicated in pain type stuff. The connection to the insula probably has to do with the fact that the pain is kind of unpleasant, ties into the ideas of disgust that we'll kind of get into that here in a second. But the way the study worked was that they either received a shock, so we have information about what's going on in their brain when they're in pain, or they saw a romantic partner getting shocked. So then we had brain activity while they were seeing someone else or getting an indication that someone else was getting shocked. And this was a really interesting tidbit here, that the participants that scored really high on a questionnaire that they took before they got into the scanner on how empathetic they were, if they scored really high on the empathy score, then they had a lot more activation when they were seeing someone else or witnessing someone else in pain. So really kind of interesting tie to the behavioral ratings. And this has been really highly replicated. So this is something that is definitely a real phenomenon and not just some study with 10 people. But researchers have kind of started to figure out that it's not just pain that's kind of happening in these regions, but they also see very similar activations when people are witnessing unfair transactions or kind of immoral acts. And so they think that it's not necessarily just pain in these regions, but it's more of just kind of this overall feeling of unpleasantness. I mean, these are the same regions that are active for disgust, right? This idea that I don't want to be anywhere near that, right? And so they think that unpleasantness in general is really activating these regions, indicating that it's something that we don't like, something that we're averse to. And what we found with these new techniques, so MVPA is multivariate pattern analysis. So this is, instead of looking at what regions are active, we're looking at what patterns of activity within those regions are actually representing something. And so we know that all of these regions that we just talked about, the Insula and the ACC, they're active for pain, they're active for unfair transactions and immoral acts, they're active for disgust. This study ended up looking at all three of these, so pain, disgust, and unfairness, found that they were lighting up the same regions, but found that patterns within those regions could differentiate between these different conditions. And so even though they were lighting up the same brain regions, it was the way those regions were being used that actually kind of represented the differences between pain and disgust and unfairness. And so it's not just that those regions it's not that those regions only kind of represent one type of information. They're kind of flexible. They can represent different types, different conditions based on how the neurons are firing within those regions, what patterns of activity are kind of underlying that stuff. So this is kind of the newer way of doing cognitive neuroscience. This is where a lot of the field is moving to now. This is what I do quite a bit of, is looking at patterns of activity rather than just what regions are active. So this is something I was hinting at a minute ago of there are some instances where you don't want to feel what other people are feeling. If you're a doctor, it would be very unpleasant to constantly be feeling the pain of your patients and things like that. I think that this does create a problem with healthcare. A lot of the times, the doctors that we've seen, you really get a lot more sympathy than empathy. It doesn't feel like they're really connecting and understanding sometimes, but that's kind of a symptom of the job, right? They have to distance themselves, or else it's mentally unstable. It's really hard to kind of go through your life if you're constantly putting yourself down where your patients are. So this is that a doctor wants to relieve a patient's pain and not feel it themselves. And so what researchers think is that this perception-action coupling, this empathizing of like trying to feel what other people feel, is happening first, and it's happening automatically. But we're able to then kind of implement cognitive control mechanisms to shut that down, to say, look, that's not appropriate right now. I can't feel what they're feeling because I have to move past that, and I need to do my job, and I need to diagnose and all of these kind of things. And so we think that kind of some stuff that we talked about in the cognitive control lecture is kind of regulating and turning off these kind of automatic empathy circuits to distance ourselves a little bit. And this was some really nice evidence that kind of gets at that. So they brought in acupuncturists and a group of controls, and they had both of these types of people watching video clips of someone either getting painful stimulation, which is actually getting a needle in the face or in the hand or in the foot, or seeing someone get non-painful stimulation. So seeing them touch this person with a Q-tip on their hand or foot or face. And then they had the controls and the experts. And what they found was that these regions in the Insula and the ACC that we've been talking about that kind of do this pain empathy were really significantly active in control. So what we're seeing here is that these red bars right here are when they're actually watching patients in pain. They're activating these ACC and Insula regions really heavily. So they're really empathizing with these people. Whereas the experts, did not have that. So the experts had been able to kind of turn that off. And we also saw that regions that are involved in self-regulation, so the cognitive control regions and attention regions, were actually more active in the experts. So it seems like the experts were able to really shut down those empathy circuits and say, I don't want to feel what they're feeling because I have a job to do, right? Really kind of cool evidence that gets at how these processes might be unfolding and how they're maybe controlled. This one gets into some really interesting stuff about gender differences with this kind of stuff. And these next slides are kind of get into the unfairness part of this. So they had these subjects play a card game that involved cash. So there was kind of a reward involved, and they were either with a Confederate who cheated or they were with one who didn't. So they were playing a card game with someone who was in on it. So this was a Confederate is someone that's part of the study that was doing things in a very deliberate way. So they were either cheating or they were not cheating. And then they used MRI to look at what was going on in the people's brains that had been playing these cards while they witnessed that Confederate receiving pain. And so that Confederate was getting shocked while the people in the MRI were witnessing it. And this was really, really interesting. So males showed a significant decrease in empathy for the cheater, but females had similar empathy responses to both. So these females in the study, it didn't matter if the person had cheated or not. There was some difference here. It wasn't significant as far as the results went, but the activity was very similar for the two. But then you look at males, and males just like didn't feel any empathy. These ACC and Insula regions were not active at all when they were seeing the cheaters get shocked. And they found that they were actually activating the nucleus accumbens and the striatum, which are reward centers, and that the activity in these reward centers was tracking with how much they had indicated they wanted revenge on the people that had cheated. And so don't read too much into conclusions like this. This is a type of reverse inference, but it appears that they felt pleasure in seeing these people in pain. We can't say that just because the reward centers were active that they were actually feeling pleasure, but this is what the activity kind of hints at, that there was some kind of inherent reward in seeing this person get punished for cheating. And so we'll kind of get into some other studies that look at how that might be unfolding. So this was one where they recruited Red Sox and Yankee fans, so really avid fans. These are very rival teams. Like the fans from these teams do not get along, and they watched baseball clips of their team either doing a successful play or the rival team being successful. And then they came back in 2 weeks later and they filled out this questionnaire about how likely they were to heckle, insult, throw food at, threaten, shove, or hit a rival fan or a neutral fan. So kind of interesting what they decided to ask them about. But what they found was that the reward regions, so striatum, nucleus accumbens type area, so this is like nucleus accumbens right above the striatum here, was really active when their team was successful. And for some reason, when their team was successful, it was correlated with self-report likelihood of aggression towards rival fans. I don't know how much you want to read into this aggression idea. It could just be that they were heckling them because that's like good fun when you go to a game. I don't know if this meant that when their team was successful, they actually wanted to shove or hit somebody. So don't read too much into that. But when they saw the rival team successful, it activated the ACC and Insula, which is what we've been showing is really active for like pain and empathy type stuff, or kind of unpleasantness in general. So we've just like, oh, that doesn't feel good. So yeah, and that's what I was just kind of getting at. So same kind of activity patterns as we saw with like pain and empathy and things like that. So there's really something to that of kind of feeling unpleasant when you're seeing bad things, and feeling really good when you're seeing good things that kind of correlate with wanting someone else to fail, is what that kind of gets at. And a lot of this, researchers believe, is developed really early on, this idea of acceptance, who we want to be around and who we don't want to be around. And they did this interesting study. This isn't an imaging study at all, but it kind of gets at some of the mechanisms that might be going on through childhood. So researchers believe that this maltreatment, this is what I was kind of talking about, that we tolerate or even enjoy the maltreatment of others, occurs really early in life. So this is the first step of this study that I'm going to get into. And so what they did was they took children that couldn't even talk yet, were given a choice between two snack foods. So we had like some crackers or some green beans. And then they introduced these puppets that one of them really liked the green beans and one of the puppets really liked the crackers. And so if the subject had indicated that they really liked the crackers, then this puppet was like them. It was similar to them. It liked the same food they liked, whereas this puppet didn't like the same food that they liked. And what they did was they had the puppets approach a snack bowl, and if it liked it, it was like, that looks really good. And then it went over to this one and was like, that's disgusting. Oh, green beans. And this one did the opposite. So it's like, green beans. And it looked at the crackers and was like, oh, that's disgusting. And the kids, they watched this whole thing unfold. And later they were shown the two puppets and they were asked which one of the two puppets they liked, which one they wanted to play with. And overwhelmingly, the kids chose the puppet that had the same preference that they did. It was like, oh, this one likes what I like. This one's like me. I want to play with this one. I don't like this one because this one doesn't like the same stuff that I do. So this was kind of a first step at this. But they kind of introduced a twist to this that I think is really, really interesting. So they did a follow-up study where they did kind of the same thing. They had these two puppets. They showed them the two different foods. One of them liked the same food that the kid did. The other one didn't. They expressed disgust or whatever. So the kids kind of had these ideas about the puppets already. But then they put on this puppet show. And they either had the one that liked the same thing they did as the star, or they had the one that didn't like what they did as kind of the star of the show. And in the show, the puppet is bouncing a ball and then ends up dropping it, and it kind of rolls away. And then a separate puppet comes in, this dog puppet comes in, and it either helps the one that just dropped the ball, so it brings the ball back to him and kind of becomes friends with them, or it steals the ball and runs away. Okay. Now, when they're given a choice between the dog puppets, this is really interesting. The kids choose the one that helped the puppet that was similar to them, but they also would choose the one that harmed the dissimilar puppet. So they wanted to hang out with the dog that helped the one that liked the food that they liked, but they also wanted to hang out with the dog that punished the one that didn't like the food that they like. And I mean, these results are staggering. I mean, look at how clear cut this is. And this happens as early as 9 months old. And so here we have white is the helpful dog, black is the harmful dog. So this is the dog that helped the puppet that was like them, that had the same food preference as them. They chose that dog. This is the dog that stole the ball from the one that wasn't like us. And then it gets even more clear cut as the child begins to age. So really, really interesting that these mechanisms of trying to distance ourselves from people that are not like us as much as possible happens really, really young. And a lot of it has to do with, they think, this idea that we're trying to identify and punish people that are violators of social contracts in a way. And so all of this kind of depends on our ability to recognize when people are cheating, when they're kind of free riding on the system, and to be able to kind of punish them and ostracize them so that we can have some kind of continuity, so our social exchange can go on without being affected, right? Because if cheating carries no penalty, then the cheaters are going to eventually kind of take over, right? And if there's a majority of cheaters, then there can't be any kind of fair reciprocal exchange in a society. And so this is something that in a social type, hierarchy with a species that is very social, it's very beneficial for that society to have these types of punishing ideas to really try to weed out who's taking advantage and who's cheating in order to get the system to run efficiently. And it's really interesting that we're seeing this kind of at an individual level that's kind of ingrained into the brain. They've tested this with something called the Ultimatum game. This is really big in like game theory. And the way that it works is that you have player 1 and player 2. Player 1 has a bit of money, and they decide how they want to split that money up and share it with player 2. And so player 1 offers a portion of the money to player 2, and player 2 either accepts that offer or rejects it. So the offer can be fair, so 50-50. So if we look over here, this is player 1 making a fair offer, and player 2 can either accept that offer or reject it. And so a fair offer would be 50-50. So if at $10, he gives 5 to player 2 and keeps 5 for himself, or it can be an unfair one where he keeps 80 for himself and only gives 20% to player 2. Now, if player 2 accepts, then they both get that amount of money. So player 2 gets 5, player 1 gets 5. If he accepts over here, player 1 gets 80 or 8, and player 2 gets 2. But if player 2 rejects the offer, then both people get 0, right? That's what we're seeing here. This is the reject arm right here. And so if we were approaching this rationally, player 2 should always accept, because they're going to get some money instead of nothing, right? But their reputation is at stake. If they start to accept unfair offers, then player 1 is going to kind of take advantage of that, and it's going to continue to offer unfair offers. And so by rejecting things, we're kind of punishing player 1 for an unfair offer. And when we punish them, because they don't get anything either, when we punish them, it encourages them to be more fair in the future. And they've kind of asked, they've done this in groups and stuff, and they've asked people about the different people in the game. And it's kind of been shown that people that often reject offers kind of gain trust from the group and respect from the group, and are kind of seen as being group focused, as having kind of the group's best interests in mind, and being altruistic. Is really interesting. So they've done studies with this in Scanner. And so they had people play the Ultimatum game while they're in the Scanner. And the subject who was in the Scanner was always player 2. So they were either accepting or rejecting offers for player 1. And what they found was that there was this activity, and don't worry too much about DLPFC. It could just be tracking the game itself. But there was this activity in the Insula that was tracking these unfair offers. And the degree to which the Insula was active predicted whether they were going to reject. So if the Insula was really active, it was really likely that player 2 was going to think that that was unfair and was going to reject it. And so this kind of gets at that idea too, that the Insula might be kind of representing unpleasantness, not necessarily like pain in general. But it really showed that like, no, that's disgusting that you would only offer me $10 and keep 9 for yourself. And the Insula was kind of tracking that idea. In the early kind of portions of this game and of the studies into this game, a lot of the punishment was believed to be in regards to the degree to which someone was being unfair. But they created a new version of this game that was really interesting that revealed that it might not be unfairness. So they had this Dictator version of the game where player 2 has to accept everything that player 1 offers. So if player 2 is like in the same room as player 1, player 1 is still going to offer unfair amounts, but they're not going to be like completely unfair. There's this degree to which like they have a reputation, they're in the same room as this person. But if player 1 is anonymous, they'll offer nothing to player 2 over and over and over again and keep everything for themselves. So that's already kind of an interesting dynamic. But they added a kind of new player into the game. So they played the game kind of in a group, and they added this player who was a punisher, who could spend some of their money to punish the dictator and to kind of get the dictator to lose money. And what they found was that if the dictator had been mistreating the punisher, so if it had been offering unfair treatment to the punisher, then the punisher would punish them often. Just be like, no, this isn't fair. You need to get better. You need to do better. But if the dictator treated the punisher really well, even if they were super unfair to everyone else, the punisher punished less. And so it's this idea that punishment may not be really related to unfairness, because the dictator was still being unfair to the rest of the group. They just were being fair to the person that was punishing. And so it may just be kind of self-interest and not necessarily kind of this global, oh, that's unfair kind of idea that people kind of thought of at first. I thought this was kind of an interesting tidbit. There's no brain data associated with this, but I thought it was kind of an interesting twist. So we'll kind of end this section with moral decisions. And so something that's really been used a lot to get at moral type decision making is the trolley car dilemma. And so picture that you're on the picture is a little bit different than the way this is usually pitched, but picture that there's this trolley car that's kind of coming down the tracks. And the way that it's usually pitched is that there's like workers down here, not necessarily people tied up. That's kind of an odd picture. But this thing is careening down the tracks. And if it keeps going the way that it's going to go, it's going to kill 5 people. So like I said, there's usually like workers on the track in the real scenario. But if it keeps going, it's going to kill 5 people. Now, let's say that you have a switch and you can throw that switch. And if you do, it's going to divert the trolley car and only 1 person is going to die instead of 5. What would you do? This is very logical to a lot of people. It's like, well, of course I'm going to throw the switch because it's better for 1 person to die than for 5 people to die. It's a very kind of utilitarian type decision. But if we add a little bit of a twist to this dilemma and we say, instead of having a switch that you can throw, instead you're standing on a footbridge and there's this kind of heavyset man in front of you. And if you push this heavyset man off and he falls on the tracks, his weight is going to be enough to stop the trolley car. So this guy, 1 person is going to die. Or if you don't do it, the trolley car is going to keep going and it's going to kill 5 people. What would you do in this case? So now this seems to be the exact same logical conclusion as the one on top. You're killing 1 person and you're saving 5. But this bottom one seems a lot more personal, right? You're actually physically touching someone. You're responsible for that person dying. Whereas here, you're a little bit distanced from it. You're just pulling a switch, right? And so when people are faced with the footbridge dilemma, overwhelmingly they say, no, I will not push the man off the bridge to save 5 people because that's murder. And people don't really see that that's the same case in the top one. It's really interesting. And so people have kind of used this to try to get at what is driving kind of emotional decisions like we see in the footbridge dilemma versus kind of distanced or logical type decisions that we see up here. And what we've kind of seen is that there's very different types of activation with these 2 different types of dilemmas. So impersonal decisions, like the trolley car one, where you're kind of distanced, was activating kind of lateral prefrontal cortex and bilateral parietal lobe. So this was just working memory stuff that you would see just in normal type logic situations in general. We're just kind of taking the information we have, we're putting it together, and we're kind of coming up with an idea of how to solve it. But when the decisions were personal, when they involved us actually like getting involved and like interacting with an actual person, we see that the medial prefrontal cortex starts to light up, along with the PCC, which is posterior cingulate cortex. So that's another area within the default mode network, and really heavy activation of the amygdala. And so these are kind of emotional and social cognition ones. We're really considering who that person is and how it's going to feel and what's wrong with that. And so there seems to be a lot more emotional involvement with these types of kind of the footbridge dilemma type ones, as opposed to just purely logical ones like pulling the switch in the trolley car dilemma. And so this is another one of those conclusions that I think you should be a little bit weary of. it does seem like this is kind of leaning towards that, but it's kind of dangerous to say just because we're getting activity in these regions doesn't mean that emotions are controlling our decisions. But we know that because we're getting activity in these emotional regions, that emotion is probably at play in these decisions. I wouldn't say that emotion is controlling our decisions, but this was kind of a conclusion from the textbook. So just kind of when you see those things, kind of look at them with a grain of salt. It is very interesting that there's different activity for these two, but it's hard to say why there's different activity for the two. And it appears that because we're seeing emotional activity in these personal decisions, that it may be that emotion is kind of taking over and driving our decisions more than just kind of logic and ration is up here. Cool. So this last part of the lecture, we'll get into some of the brain regions that are involved in what we described at the beginning of mental state attribution theory. And so this is the theory that really describes how we build models of what other people are going to do based on what they've done before, based on kind of cultural influences or stereotypes and things like that. Really trying to put ourselves in other people's perspectives. They're really big in kind of theory of mind type stuff. So it's kind of what we're going to focus on, are like brain regions that are involved in mentalizing or theory of mind type stuff. So a lot of the times, someone's mental state doesn't really match up with what they're outwardly expressing, right? And so you ask someone out, they smile but say no. It's like, why did they smile? What did that mean, right? You try to dig into all of this stuff, try to like figure out what their intentions are. Like, did they kind of like me, but they were just busy? Or like, people can kind of drive themselves nuts going through these types of scenarios, or like text messages especially, right? Just like trying to figure out what someone meant by what they said, even though they're being sarcastic or something. You can spend hours trying to figure out meaning behind something like that. This stuff is more in regards to like actual behavioral cues. So when we're actually interacting with a person, but I think similar stuff might be going on in other situations. And so it's this idea that humans consistently hide their true intentions due to cultural type reasons or personal reasons or whatever. And we have a lot of brain kind of power is devoted to trying to discover when there's mismatches between what they're showing us and what they really mean. And it allows us to build trust. It allows us to understand what they're doing and why they're doing it. Really, really important type of process in social communities. It's really important to trust people and to know who you can trust, or else you'll kind of get taken advantage of. So there's a lot of MPFC involvement with this kind of stuff. And some of the studies that have kind of gotten at this have looked at kind of impression formation. And so they did this study where they showed people pictures of these people, and then they had some kind of a statement that described kind of what that person was doing. And so it allowed you to kind of form an impression of who that person is and what they might be like. And the other condition was just they either said, I want you to form an impression, so read this and actually try to apply it to this person, or just read this and try to remember what order it was in. And that allowed them to kind of do these contrasts to see what was different when they were actually forming impressions versus when they were just kind of doing this memorization technique. And what they found was that the medial prefrontal cortex was really heavily involved in this impression formation type activity. And you'll notice it's kind of dorsal here. And so this was very similar to the activity that we saw to dissimilar others. And so it could be that this portion of the MPFC is really trying to work out what people are like, that we don't know, that aren't like us, just based on some kind of clues that we've been given. And so what they ended up finding too was that this is very specific to animate objects. So the MPFC is not going to light up. So let's say that this was a picture of a rock, and he said at the party he was dancing on the table. The MPFC will not track that. There's something specific to it being something that's alive. I've seen studies in which it's very specific to people. You'll get some activation for animals, but this is very specific to people. This region of the brain is really heavily involved in social interaction with humans, because that's what's important to us, you know? And the last region that we'll get into is the TPJ. And so the temporal parietal junction. So this is where the temporal lobe and the parietal lobe kind of meet with one another. This is where you're seeing like kind of back in here and back through here. They had, in this study, they were having subjects view a series of false belief and true belief tasks. So this is like the Sally and Ann stuff that we talked about earlier, of like trying to take the perspective of someone else to try to understand them, and understanding that the person either had a false belief or had a true belief. And what they found was that the right TPJ, it's the right temporal parietal junction, was really active during these false belief tasks of really trying to understand someone else's perspective and put ourselves in someone else's shoes. And so what they think is that that region, it must be really heavily involved in what we've kind of termed theory of mind in social psychology, of really trying to understand someone else's mental state. And it's become a target for a lot of people that really study theory of mind. And this group of researchers that did this original study followed up to make sure that it really was theory of mind that was kind of driving this effect that they saw. And so they brought people in and they used the same study that we were just talking about to locate the TPJ in these subjects. They wanted to know exactly what region was involved in these false belief tasks. And then once they knew what region was activated, this is called a localizer, they were then able to explore that region for patterns of activity. And so then they gave the subjects these scenarios that had three components. So there was either social background, like she lives in New York, mental state, like she wants to figure out what to do today, or she wants to be a dancer, or she's feeling sad, something like that, or life event. So she just got into grad school or something like that. And so they were trying to kind of pit these three different conditions against each other to try to say, is there something specific about the right TPJ that has to do with mental state? Or is it just something that has to do with kind of personal information in general? Because all of this information is kind of telling you about who that person is, but only one of the conditions really gets at what they believe or what they feel and those kind of things. And so they were using kind of MVPA, as we've talked about before, looking at patterns of activity versus just the region in general. And they found that the right TPJ was a lot more involved in mental state than any of the other two. And so it gave this really nice evidence that it's not just tracking kind of information about people, but it's heavily kind of involved in really trying to take their perspective, to try to simulate what they're thinking and what they're feeling. So really heavily involved in theory of mind. And if you guys remember from our last lecture, the whole out-of-body experience stuff was stimulating a region that was right by the TPJ. And so it's this idea of kind of putting ourselves in a different perspective. And when we stimulate it, when we activate it, we put ourselves into a different perspective and actually have an out-of-body experience. So really, really cool finding. TPJ is a very popular region in social science right now. And this is all I got for you today. So thank you again for listening.